welcome back to the Mars Hill House of Intellectual Discourse. I'm Joshua Johnson, and we're continuing in our Rethinking Reality study, going through the dialogues of Hylas and Philonous by George Berkeley, and understanding the thought of Jonathan Edwards. And with that, we're going to review some more, review especially last study and then some of the studies before that. The first thing was with Jonathan Edwards, which was our last study, which is sort of like our interlude between the first and second dialogue. In that study, we brought out Jonathan Edwards and we said, okay, well, does Jonathan Edwards agree with Berkeley as we've seen thus far in the first dialogue? Would we all agree that he does?
Yes.
It seems clear that Edwards, his view of reality is that which we perceive exists in the mind, in created or uncreated consciousness, as he would say. And the evidence was overwhelming in his work, The Mind, as well as in various other works like Of Being, on Atoms, Miscellanies, various different works. It seems to be quite clear. And likewise, it seems that many of his arguments, he presupposes this thought. And we're going to be going through some of those other positions further down the road. He has an argument for the Trinity called the psychological argument for the Trinity, which was originally developed by St. Augustine, but Edwards tweaks it and sort of makes it his own using ideas that he has gained from the British empirical school. In particular, the idealism that he shares with Berkeley. Likewise, we covered, in understanding that, we saw that his view of reality is very much theocentric. We haven't seen quite that much yet with Berkeley like we've seen in Edwards, but in almost every single Edwards quote, there's always a direct relationship back to God. And now, the ministry of Edwards, I mean, Edwards was not teaching philosophy, he was not instructing in that. He was very much just focused on his ministry work. And for that reason, everything was theocentric all the time. He wasn't doing a specific philosophical treatise just for, reacting to certain opponents. He was mostly doing his work for the edification of his congregation. And some of the philosophical works that we do have from him were done while he was at school or during that period while he was doing tutoring at Yale. And so we see that Edwards tends to be more theocentric, but we'll see that Berkeley is definitely on the same page with Edwards in seeing God as the center of everything. And that's what we're going to be investigating tonight and going into the second dialogue. We're going to start to see Berkeley's, his real interest starting to come out. So we see that Edwards corresponds with the first dialogue, and the first dialogue was, of course, establishing that objects are a collection of sense experiences, and all experiences are done by someone having the experience, the subject. So therefore, all objects, being a collection of little experiences, exist in the mind. And all of reality is that way. So that's the first dialogue. That's what we learned in the first dialogue. That was all of Berkeley's arguments thus far. That's the groundwork. Edwards agrees with them. And now we're going back to the study goals real quick and remembering that we're studying Berkeley for the purpose of understanding Edwards. And we're going to see why, once we conclude the dialogue, we're going to briefly discuss some of the implications of Edwards' thought for today and some of today's issues. But also with these goals, we're also going to understand that Berkeley's whole purpose in this was not vain philosophizing. In fact, he was very critical of what he calls philosophers. In fact, he'll even say that, unlike the philosophers, I believe this, or this is what the philosophers believe. He didn't call himself a philosopher, and yet when we do studies of Berkeley, we're saying, oh, he was one of the three British empiricists, he was a philosopher, but Berkeley was very critical of that. He didn't like to be associated with them. He thought of philosophers as men who vainly think about things repugnant to common sense and to the sacred scriptures. So for Berkeley, he didn't want to be associated with that class. However, we've come to know him as a philosopher because of the type of arguments he used. And so we got to understand that Berkeley's goal was to react to these philosophers, react to this belief in a mind-independent reality, which he thought was just total insanity. We think of it because of the tradition that we've all grown up in our science classes, in our society, the way things we've been taught, that it'd be counterintuitive to say that objects don't exist independent of my mind. Now, of course, Berkeley would say they exist independent of your mind, but they're in other minds. But to think of that idea is kind of like contrary to the way we think. It's almost like you can't grasp it almost at first. It's hard to leap over this little hill in our thinking. But for Berkeley, this is the thing that we all really know deep down. We understand this, and we just, for some reason, we're ingrained with these thoughts that we get from the world around us. And Berkeley's trying to get back to that. You get back to what he calls common sense, or something that corresponds directly to what he saw as the teachings of Scripture. And we're going to really get into some of that tonight. So we got to remember that he's reacting to what he calls philosophers who believed in mind-independent reality, and they refer to this mind-independent reality as a material reality. So the existence of matter. Matter typically is also used interchangeably, especially if you look at René Descartes, as substance, or substance in general, which is poorly defined. It's that thing which underlies the objects that we actually see, or upholds them in some way. However, when you get into people like Locke, who made a division between what is seen and what is unseen, you couldn't really end up describing the unseen. You can't use extension. Extension's in the mind. All these other different qualities are in the mind. Well, what is substance then? It's unknowable. It's a meaningless term. And that's some of the stuff that we went over in the first dialogue. But we got to remember that that's Berkeley's point. Berkeley's going after this. He sees it as the great enemy of Christianity of his time. He is an heir of a young, Reformed Anglican community in Ireland and in Britain. And you see the same thing with Edwards. Edwards is, the Reformation's been going on for 150 years or so. And now you're seeing the Enlightenment really come into full bloom. Kant hasn't really come on the scene yet, but you have the British empiricism already been established. You have the continental rationalists. You have these individuals already in full power. You see deism on the rise. You see Arminianism coming back with full force all over the place. You see a lot of different things going on, and these men were saying, okay, no, this is what we believe to be the reformational response to some of these ideas in the Enlightenment. And somehow in their dialoguing with these individuals, they've come down to be called Enlightenment thinkers themselves, which I think they would find that just a total repulsive notion. They thought of themselves as clergy defending ideas of their tradition, of their theological tradition. And so we're really going to get into that and see if we can agree with that. Are the goals that Berkeley has set forth, that is to refute materialism in order to also refute atheism and skepticism, are those goals met? Are those goals the goals that we see in the dialogue? Do they correspond to anything I'm saying right now? Is it really Berkeley's intention? Has he done it? Is he doing it? Is he going in the right direction? Is matter the position which inevitably leads to skepticism and atheism? That's one of the questions. Is it inconsistent with Christian teaching? We really need to analyze that. Is this notion, this philosophical notion of matter, a problem? And in getting rid of it, does it make things better within a Christian framework and for society? Does it reform science? Does it get rid of atheism? Does it prevent immorality? Does it stop this slippery slope from transpiring? And so I think we really need to pay open mind and see what Berkeley is trying to say in the second dialogue. It's going to get very interesting. He's dealing with a very different hylas, and the next two dialogues we're going to see that. Hylas is going to get more and more aggressive as time goes on, and it's going to be very interesting. So with that, we're going to go to the dialogues. Okay, we're back. We just finished reading in this section of the dialogues, in the second dialogue of Hylas and Philonous. And there are some interesting arguments that are being brought up, quite a few in this short section that we read. There's also a lot of monologues in it, but despite that, there was a lot of good content, not just speaking for the sake of speaking, which can happen in older literature. So in this section, we have a couple of things that I think are really interesting to cover. Some of them are extremely relevant to modern debates, and I'm not going to get into them too in depth, only because I want to save that to after we're finished with the dialogues and starting to apply Edwards' thought to issues like in philosophy of mind. But one of the first ones is the mind versus brain argument. Can anybody tell me a little bit about what that argument was?
He says that the brain is what is causing the ideas, with the firing of the nerves are talking to the brain. I can't find it.
Yeah.
You find it.
top of 94 there.
Different impressions they make on the organs of sense. Vibrating motions to the nerves.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I got what you're saying,
Yeah.
but yeah, in the dialogue, what Hylas is saying is that the brain sort of takes like a mediating role between the sensible world that exists. Well, and this is sort of like where he gets into the contradictions anyway. Right off the bat, he's just saying that the brain is what causes the experience in the mind, and the brain is actually what is experiencing the sensations out there. So he was going to use this as a leapfrog into matter, but Philonous wouldn't let him get that far. And does anybody know what Philonous is? What's his rebuttal to this? To this idea that the brain has this kind of role?
Because the brain's a sensible thing.
Ah, okay. Well, where do sensible things exist?
In the mind.
The mind.
In the mind. Aha. This is a big deal. This is a big deal even for modern philosophy, because almost no one holds this position, and it would be a serious issue. And Philonous ridicules this notion. I mean, he really thinks it's about as stupid as it gets. Okay, you're saying that, okay, that the brain is the cause of my mental content, of these things, of my experiences. Okay, well, how do you know of this brain? Well, some people will say, well, I never perceived my own brain. Okay, well, you perceive other brains, you know pictures of brains, and people are telling you there's one in your skull causing all this. So, you conclude, therefore, that this thing that you conceive of being in your skull is what's causing your experience. It is what's making reality to you. Or is doing some sort of work in this. It is causing the sensations in some way. So, but how do you, if you know of it as a collection of experiences, that is, you've seen the gray matter, you felt the shape, you read it in a textbook, however, it reduces back to this same knowledge that likewise exists in the mind. Everything you know about the brain is sensible. It's sensible, and therefore it is just like all other sensible things. It's a collection of experiences that exist in the mind. Now, what he's arguing here is that the mind is distinct from the brain. Now, Hylas hasn't disagreed with that. All right, but what he's saying is that the brain is what's doing most of the work, and then it communicates it to the mind. But what he gets here is that, and he gets into a really interesting, it shows him that there's a really serious issue with this, is the idea of, can sensible objects have that sort of effect on other sensible objects? Can ideas cause other ideas, or can only minds cause ideas? Now, he's going to get into this argument a little bit further, but one of the things here that I want to bring up is, and this is from Philonous' statements, besides spirits, all that we know or conceive are our own ideas. When therefore you say all ideas are occasioned by impressions in the brain, do you conceive this brain or not? If you do, then you talk of ideas imprinted in an idea causing that same idea, which is absurd. If you do not conceive it, you talk unintelligibly, which is, going back to the master argument, instead of forming a reasonable hypothesis. So, what he's saying is, your idea of a brain, like you're sensing it, okay, is, like what we, and this is assuming Hylas' argument. Okay, he's assuming Hylas' argument for a moment, assuming that the brain's doing the work. So the brain learned about the brain. Okay, so a sensible object that's in your mind learns of a sensible object, learns of a brain, and then that sensible object is the cause of the sensible object. It's a big loop. It's a big circle. So, and what he's saying is, okay, you're claiming that you have, I have like no room on this board. Okay, you have a sensible idea of a brain. Okay, that's my idea. So, it leaves an impression upon my brain, and that impression causes my knowledge of the brain in my soul. Okay, but see, now this is a loop. Okay, because you're saying that my idea is the cause of my idea of that idea. It's a big circle. And that's what the point that Berkeley's bringing out. You're saying that that this thing that can only exist in your mind is the cause of that thing which is in your mind. It's so contradictory. It's almost hard to even speak and utter, and that's because of the profound absurdity of it. If anything is learned by sense, if it is experienced, it exists in the mind. So for us, we often even think, and this is actually, he's responding to René Descartes here a little bit, who's errors in the mind-body relationship have served as the basis for all philosophy in that field ever since. René Descartes said that the soul is located on a particular part of the brain. He used to say the pituitary gland, which is the pineal gland, I mean. The pineal gland would release certain chemicals in through the spinal system in order to cause the body's motions. He said the soul resided there. Now, he was critiqued by, I believe her name was Catherine. She was a noble woman, might have been a princess of, I think, like Bohemia or Slovakia or something like that. And she was a student. Now, Descartes believed in matter. He believed that the body was material, the soul was immaterial. Immaterial, of course, means not extended. So she asked him, she's like, well, how can an immaterial thing that affect a material thing? How can it have an effect on the body? Where is it at? And if it's immaterial, it's not extended, so you can't say it's in one location, because one location is an extended region of space. So how could it be there and not everywhere at the same time? Similarly, if only physical things have physical effects, like for instance, the idea that fire will transfer heat to another object, well, two physical things have an effect on each other. You're saying the soul is nothing physical about it at all. How can it have any effect whatsoever on a body? That was sort of the question she asked Descartes. Descartes had no answer. And he was really embarrassed by it. And ever since then, it's been an issue in philosophy. Now, Berkeley here is responding in a very different way. Now, the objection that I believe her name was Catherine had would serve as sort of the stronghold for atheism to say, well, why posit a soul at all? Well, Berkeley's flipping it all on its head. He's saying that, well, the issue isn't that you posited a soul. The issue is that you posited material reality. The idea, the issue, that's not, you're mistaking the whole issue. Atheism took Descartes' problem and ran with it. Descartes was inconsistent. Descartes said, I have a soul in a material body having effect on material mind-independent substance. So in a sense, when you say that the soul is located in the body, that was the problem. But rather, what Berkeley's saying is, well, actually the body's located in the soul in a sense. He's saying that it is something that you experience, it exists in your mind. And what is, like for instance, I can't see my back right now, and either can you. So where's my back? Well, God perceives my back, and we're going to be getting into this in a little bit. That the existence of a reality external to my particular perceiving of it is always and constantly perceived by God. And that what does come into my mind, He wills into my mind. The brain is a perceptual object. Now there's a correlation, no doubt. If I'm thinking about soda pop, you might be able to look on a screen and see a certain synapse firing in the brain. But now, is that brain, that synapse firing, the cause of me thinking about the soda? Is my thinking about the soda the cause of that synapse firing? Neither. It's a correlation, a correlated event. The fact is that God has revealed at one time my sensation or my imagination of soda, and also simultaneously has decreed the event of a synapse firing. They're not causally related. The brain didn't cause me to have that sensation, and neither did I cause that synapse to fire. There's a correlation in God's decree. So ordered in such a way that we would describe it using laws. We could do the same thing about many things. When we experience the feeling of coldness, at such a point, we also happen to see water enter into a solid state that we call ice. Now, did coldness cause the water to freeze, or did God cause the water to freeze at a particular moment? We would say, and this is what Berkeley's conclusion would be, we say God caused it. And He caused it at the same time that we experience coldness. And that's the way that He decides to reveal Himself, because He's sovereign and He just does what He wishes. And He does it in such an orderly way over time, we can describe it with laws. If I throw an object up, it falls. Did a force of some sort cause the object to fall? No. What caused the object to fall is God Himself. He is acting frame by frame, moment to moment, revealing those images to my mind in such a way that objects always fall in relation to their mass. I can describe that with the law of gravitation. There's not a force that's independent of God doing this. There's nothing in the object itself that causes it to fall. Rather, God has just so ordained that when you throw something up, it comes down in the way that He's decreed it to do over time. Laws are descriptions of God's causal activity. That's Berkeley's argument. And so when the mind-brain issue is very uniquely solved in Berkeley, and of course in Edwards. Now Edwards actually goes into more depth on this very particular issue in a way that is very serious for issues right now in the philosophy of mind, which is arguably one of the most ripe fields for inquiry right now in philosophy. Arguably, I would say probably the best field for debate and discussion on these sort of matters. And I think this solution kind of goes past the whole issue between Descartes and his student, which has been that debate is what still is the focus of philosophy. You know, what is the mind? How can it relate to a physical world? To this day, they're trying to reconcile my consciousness, my conscious experience, with the belief, this a priori belief, there must be this external material world. Berkeley, in other words, go right around and says, well, get rid of the material world. Save consciousness. Save the mind. Save the soul. Problem solved. And we don't have to be reduced to absurdity, as some are currently doing. Now, another thing that got brought up is skepticism. Now, Hylas thinks that philonous is a skeptic. Now, and why does he think that?
Because he says he's agreed to all the same premises, and he says, have you all along agreed to the premises, and do you now deny the conclusion and leave me to maintain those paradoxes by myself which you led me into?
You're right, but philonous rebuts. He's basically saying that when he replies to Hylas, that, well, actually, I never really agreed to the conclusion that you are forced to admit, skepticism. Now, in Philonous' mind, what was really the skepticism? Why is Hylas now a skeptic? And was he actually really a skeptic all along? I mean, you don't even have to go to the reading for this. I mean, to be honest, like, what was it about Hylas that led him to skepticism? It was the belief in a mind-independent reality. That was what led him to skepticism. Okay, because he believed that I have what I see and perceive, and yet I maintain this mind-independent reality, that these objects exist independent of my perceiving them. What the first dialogue was all about was saying that no, all things exist in the mind. But what the consequence of this is that he's maintaining something that he has no ability to know of. So basically, after the first dialogue, this is where Hylas is at. I believe in the existence of a mind-independent reality. It's impossible for me to know it. It's actually, by definition, unknowable. That's skepticism. That is the belief that knowledge is impossible. Or knowledge is impossible on something that, of that point, that's really matter. That was just self-evident. My own experiences were shown to be in my mind. This is before the discussion of God was really brought in. But as far as a reality independent of my own mind, Hylas was forced to say, it's unknowable. Now this is where we'll see that Berkeley's point comes in, and he says that those principles which first lead men to skepticism, pursued to a point, will lead him back to common sense. You first have to realize that this mind-independent reality is completely unknowable. And then when you're pushed a little bit further, you'll see that it necessitates God. And that's the reality that you need to be positing. Mm-hmm. Not just this vague, undefinable substance, material stuff. And so who's the skeptic? Who's the skeptic? Who's the skeptic? And the reason I use that little subtitle is because typically the person who says that, well, there is no stuff out there, it's all that which exists in the mind. He's the individual that's labeled the skeptic. You're denying the reality of things. No, in fact, you'll see Philonous really hammering this home. No, I'm the one who's affirming the reality of things. You're the one who's saying that things have an absolute existence independent of anybody thinking about it, perceiving it, or seeing it. It's like, can you see an unseen object? Can you conceive of an unconceivable thing? So the moment you do, you're conceiving of it or seeing it. So it's absurd, it's impossible. That was what the master argument was used to demonstrate. It's silliness. So you're actually the one who's a skeptic. You're asserting unknowable things. Things that you believe exist but are outside the possibility of knowledge. Whereas I'm saying things are what they are. They are A chair is brown, hard, rectangular. It is what it is. And if it is what it is, it's a collection of sensible experiences. And experiences must exist in an experiencer. That's the point. Who's the skeptic? It is not the person who says it all exists in the mind. It's the person who says something exists outside the mind. Because that's totally inconceivable. Now, and the next thing I want to get to is, let me look here. Okay, what is Berkeley's argument for God? I call it the Noetic Argument for God. That's not a term that's used to describe it, but I choose that phrase because I think it represents it well, which is the idea that it's mental, from nous, from mind, noetic.
Well, the fact that things have to exist in the mind, so at some point there has to be some mind.
You're right.
Which is God.
Yes.
You can see everything.
Yeah. Absolutely. So, but how does he give this basis? Okay, so let's just start from what you know, okay, before we even get to the God question. Okay, you have sensible things. Let's pretend you're hylas. You've just been shown that they exist in your mind. How do you come up with a conclusion for God's existence? All you have is what you see. This is what Philonous' answer is. He says, when I realize that everything can only exist in the mind, that's what Hylas has been shown already in the first dialogue. Before we even get to the God question, that's what Hylas knows. He goes, all things perceived must exist in a mind. They're in my mind presently, but here's the thing. Do I know all things, or am I always learning? Or do I know all things simultaneously? Like, am I perceiving that room at this moment when I walk into the kitchen? Does the kitchen now come into my mind? Yes. Well, it wasn't there a minute ago. Where did it come from? Was it in my mind? So where? That's the point. That's where he's saying from necessity. Okay, when you see a chair, you've already been shown, it must be in a mind. When it's not my mind, does it disappear? And when it reappears in my mind, where did it go? How did it get back? That's the question. I have no power over it. I did not summon it back and summon it to disappear. I had no control over that. I was passive. That's the beauty of it. You're passive. So, it necessarily implies it can only exist in a mind. It must exist in some other mind. That's the necessity. So what the argument is that if all objects I see must be in a mind, and objects are coming into my mind from somewhere else, they must be coming from a mind. Because that's the only place they can exist. They can only exist in a mind. There is no material substance. That's already been disproven. That's ridiculous. It must exist in some other mind. It could not come from anywhere else. So, what he's saying is, if you're looking at a table, the very fact you're looking at that table necessitates God's existence. Just by looking at it. And if you walk into a room that you weren't presently at, as you walk into that room, the fact that you're starting to see something is the fact that you're starting to see a table and a counter and a glass of water on the table. The fact that you're starting to see those things proves God's existence as a necessity. He must exist because the fact that something is coming into my view, or if you take a bite of cake, the fact that I'm sensing sweetness, those necessitate God's existence. Because it necessitates that things are being communicated to my mind and they can only come from another mind. That's the argument. I call it the Noetic Argument for God. Some people might complain about that title, but I think it's good. And I guess it was really good if you're going to use it against atheists, so you're nagging them. So, but yeah, it's a really, I think, interesting argument. Any questions on that argument? Well, moving on then, we see a couple things. Well, the first one I'm going to get to the Mel Brauns thing last. I might just explain that a little bit. And I want you guys to go to your text on this. You see Philonous and Hylas discussing this very issue of the argument. Because Berkeley, through Philonous, gives the argument for God. And then Hylas says, but don't all Christians believe these things? Can anybody find that?
This is no more than I and all Christians hold, no, and all others too who believe there is a God and he knows and comprehends all things.
Can you continue, Jared, on that with the next section?
Where are we?
It's 97.
Okay. Yes, but here lies the difference.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Men commonly believe that all things are known and perceived by God because they believe the being of a God, whereas I, on the other hand, immediately and necessarily conclude the being of a God because all sensible things must be perceived by him.
Okay, so can anybody describe the distinction then? Okay, what did philonous just say?
There's a difference between saying there's a God and therefore he perceives all, and saying that sensible things really do exist, and if they really exist, they are necessarily perceived by an infinite mind, therefore there is an infinite mind or God.
What he's reacting to is a tendency to say, like, well, I mean, most Christians would say, is like, well, I believe in a God, and I believe he knows all things. Mm-hmm. Okay? But right there, you're making, that position could be shared by a deist, who could say that God sort of stands outside and he just perceives everything. He sees it all. But now you're not saying that in the world itself there's a necessity for his existence and his all-knowing as an act of will. Okay? Because things come from God into my mind, he's necessarily omniscient and also necessarily the origin of reality continuously, providentially. A person can believe in a God who's just really well aware, and then satisfy the definition of omniscience that way. I believe, this is belief in an all-knower. I can believe in an all-knower. So can a deist. You can believe in a God who knows all things. But what this position is a necessity of an all-knower. That is, and it's not just simply an all-knower, but an active all-knower. One who, I would say, knows all things because I know anything. If I know anything, he must know all things because he's the origin of everything we all know. By necessity. That's why he's saying there's a big difference. And hylas brought this up because all Christians believe in an all-knower. And he goes, but there's a difference here. I'm saying that an all-knower is necessary, or else we couldn't have any thoughts of reality at all. There could be no reality unless there was an all-knower. The deist isn't making that statement. Or else he might say that there might have been a God who started it all off, but then just sort of stands back and watches it and knows everything that's going on. That's not what's going on here. The moment-to-moment continuity of my experience demands an all-knower because he is the one supplying that experience. So it's a very different position to take. And what Berkeley's point is here is that not that I believe that there's such a being, but such a being is necessary. Necessary for my experience. And now obviously he's not saying that you start just with your experience and then work your way up. Obviously, Berkeley's a Christian, and you see that his whole point of this book was to defend the Christian faith. So he starts with faith as the reason and motivation for developing this philosophy. But he's saying, from common experience, we can conclude the necessity of God. And I think he's done a decent job of doing that. What do you think? An interesting take. Because in most Christian philosophers you'll find who debate these sort of things, they would prefer just holding to this first section. I believe that there's an all-knower. They prefer that. They'll come up with their own proofs for God as a first cause, a cosmological. They'll say intelligent designer, teleological argument. They might even go so far as saying that he's necessary for human knowledge in various degrees, which is very different types of presuppositional argument. And all the different arguments have some of their own merits. However, and we'll get later on into the Trinity argument that Edwards kind of throws into all this that also has roots in historic Christian thought. But what Berkeley is doing here, he's saying that, and it's so funny that many Christian philosophers haven't really gone this far, is that I'm not just positing the belief in a God who supplies aspects of my knowledge or supplied the first cause to get the ball rolling. I'm positing a God who is that the world is continually moment-to-moment dependent upon. The God of Calvinism and of the deterministic compatibilist Christianity. We're not talking about a vague notion of deity here. We're talking about a very specific being. Now, this alone I don't think establishes the God of Christianity per se. I think that there will be some other points that get brought up that will lead to that conclusion. Berkeley doesn't do it, but Edwards does it, and I'll show that later on. But I think there's a good starting point here for dialoguing. Okay, well, maybe there is some good arguments to be investigated in theistic debate. Now, one thing I wanted to bring up, and I'm sure some of you guys might have been confused, on Mel Branch. There was a lot of talk about Mel Branch and about this other Christian philosopher who's talking about the uniting with God's substance and the various different things. I'm trying to think what page that was on.
99.
On 99. You'll see, in the brackets. Now, it starts off, I think, on... Yeah, it starts out on page 98, where hylas says, "It cannot be denied there is something highly serviceable to religion in what you advance. But do you not think it looks very like a notion entertained by some eminent moderns of seeing all things in God?" That's a reference to Mel Branch. And he continues down with the discussion. Unless you're very up-to-date on the philosophical debate at the time, it's kind of hard to understand. But Mel Branch influenced Berkeley. It's undeniable. In fact, the two men met. There was an old rumor that when they met, shortly after, Mel Branch had a heart attack because he was so upset over the encounter. But that was dismissed, though, sometime later on because the dates didn't add up. But the men did disagree strongly, and Berkeley wants to make it clear here because Mel Branch was popular in England at the time. He was popular amongst various Puritan thinkers. And he was very popular with a man, I'm trying to remember his name, I believe it was Mr. Norris. I can't remember what his first name was. But he was in... No, not Chuck Norris. But this particular philosopher was one of the Cambridge Platonists, and he adopted a lot of Mel Branch's thought, and he was also an influence on Jonathan Edwards. So Mel Branch was indirectly influential on Jonathan Edwards, as he was also on Berkeley. I brought this up in the very first study in discussing sort of the basis for Berkeley's thought, but Mel Branch believed in what was the doctrine called occasionalism. Occasionalism is also commonly called continuous creation theory. It's really a doctrine of providence, not really of creation, so the term is misleading. But occasionalism basically teaches is that every successive moment of time is utterly dependent upon God's active decree. So, if it weren't, that's basically, if you follow like Augustine's thought, who says that a past moment no longer exists, you can't go back to it. A future moment does not yet exist because it's no longer actuated, but you exist in a present moment. That basically, if you take Augustine's model there from the Confessions, and then apply what Mel Branch was trying to say, he's basically saying that God decrees that present moment falls into non-existence as a past moment, and then future moment comes into existence as a present moment. So continuously, moment to moment, God decrees the present actively. So and why this influenced Berkeley is in Berkeley's idealism, God is continuously revealing reality to our minds, frame by frame, moment to moment. Now, the difference with Mel Branch is Mel Branch still claimed that matter existed. Now, of course, this led to various contradictions, because it basically made the doctrine of matter pointless. The whole reason they posited the doctrine of matter was, I want to explain causation in the world. If a glass falls, it's because of matter. How it breaks is somehow, all the things that I observe are reducible to the interactions of a material universe, of a mind independent. Everything that you do, if you go to church, it's because a certain region of your brain responds to certain type of chemical stimulants from your various activities, and so you see that everything is reducible to that. If you do a violent crime, it has something to do with your genetics through natural selection going back to the Big Bang. You know, it's all traceable to this mind-independent material reality. That's the reason the material theory was even posited, to explain things. And Mel Branch maintained that matter existed, but he said that it doesn't have any causal power. It made no sense. That's why you see philonous criticizing it, is he goes, that God created the material world in vain. Because that's basically what Mel Branch was saying. He said, saying that, well, when I see a ball hit another ball, it exists independent of my mind. It is material, but when the cue ball hit the 8 ball, it's not what sent the 8 ball in motion. God actually created frame by frame the cue ball hitting the 8 ball, and then so on and so forth. Which is what Berkeley would agree to, but Berkeley would say, well, that's being revealed in my mind. Whereas Malebranche is saying, no, God just does that for the heck of it, but it does exist independent of your mind. Because what's the point then? You've eliminated any kind of causal efficacy or meaning to the idea of a mind-independent reality. It doesn't do anything anyway, so why posit it at all? Why not say that when I see a ball hit another ball, that's just God acting and revealing it to my mind? Why say that that event is acting independent of the mind? Well, it didn't make any sense. And another thing is, too, that he points out that he's critical of Malebranche. Malebranche was a rationalist. He was very influenced by René Descartes, and so it's not odd that Malebranche had contradictions, because we just discussed Descartes' mind-body problem a little bit and the problems it had. But Malebranche was trying to integrate Augustinian thought, which he was trying to revive in the Catholic tradition. Malebranche was a Catholic priest, I don't know if I mentioned that. So he's reviving Augustinian thought and integrating it with René Descartes' rationalism. And so he was trying to say, well, you can't trust the senses. These sensible things don't really tell us what the object is. If I see a chair, basically my senses are deceiving me. I think they're accurate. So I might assume that that's really a chair I'm looking at, but I can't really know what that is that's there. Senses deceive you. That's the rationalists. They want to trace all knowledge to laws and principles that govern, and they're abstract, and then they reduce back to the being of God. And so in order to really know anything, you have to have, God actually has to sort of know it for you, which is the idea that Malebranche was sort of entertaining. And Berkeley says none of this stuff really makes any sense. Why not just say we see things that necessitate God, the end of it? Why get into all this area that I can't trust the senses, I don't really know what's there, but I believe it's there for some reason, even though it serves no purpose, God must have just created it in vain. Even Malebranche said his theory, Malebranche admitted that his belief in matter didn't make any sense. He admitted it. He said, but I believe it by faith because the Roman Catholic Church holds it. But in the end, the Roman Catholic Church didn't even side with Malebranche. He ended up burning half his books because he challenged too much the established theology and, well, actually the philosophy of Aristotle that was supported and taught through Thomas Aquinas, which was the scholasticism of the time, which both the Reformation and the Enlightenment were responding to. But Malebranche was challenging it. He said, well, we need to go back to Augustine, and we need to integrate these new ideas from René Descartes. The Catholic Church said, we're not having any of it. You're done. As much as he tried to stay orthodox, Malebranche was written off, as long as many other different types of Roman Catholic movements in France at the time. So, like the Jansenist movement. So, very interesting issue. And the only reason he brought it up is because he was being accused of being Malebranchian so much. The only thing he really kept from Malebranche is the idea that God continuously... Yes, occasionalism, continuous creation theory. But he used it in a way that was consistent. God is constantly revealing reality to me. It's communication. Communication is moment to moment, signal by signal. So, and that's exactly how it works. Any questions? No? Well, I think this has been an interesting study. It's been kind of fast and furious, but we covered some really important things. There's a lot. It's a very short dialogue, but it's very dense with discussion. Like I said, we covered a huge breadth of philosophy tonight and theology. And some of these issues, especially when we get to the mind-brain thing, that's going to be coming back. And, of course, the Noetic Argument for God is going to be coming up quite a bit. And we're going to see how later on, especially with Jonathan Edwards, he uses this as a stepping stone to then show that not only is there a supreme mind, but if there's a supreme mind, there must also be a triune God. A triune God who, by reason, by using reason, following this definition, necessarily corresponds to the Trinity formulation of the Nicene Creed, with eternal processions and everything, from reason.
Wow.
And with this mind-brain argument, we're going to see how this notion that the brain and the body exist in minds solves various problems in the philosophy of mind right now. So, and Edwards is basically might be the most underestimated and under-researched philosopher to have ever walked the earth. And I think there's some important things that need to be discussed. So, until next time. So I hope you enjoyed the study, and